Hey, Rocky, bro. Or Rocky BR. Or Rocky. Yeah, well, of course, I pretty much just agree with the point of your video. I, I guess it's interesting the examples you use and stuff, so I will elaborate. I've said this before, but my own conviction about skepticism, Pyrrhonistic specifically, not academic, but Pyrrhonistic skepticism. Well, some of the academic skeptics, but yeah, let's just stick with outlines of Pyrrhonism. Applying to natural philosophy and science are as follows. I mean, I started out getting interested in philosophy by an interest in physics, and I always thought, well, geez, philosophy, and people complain that philosophy is bullshit and stuff, and well, the problem is that it ought to come from reality. The patterns you believe in, like the law of conservation, that's a very general rule you can see in natural philosophy, has got a lot of mileage out of that. And so we try to apply those principles, or relativity, and the same kind of thing. Relativity is a good example because there's a history of relativity, in philosophy. Well, it goes back. I mean, the principle of relativity predates, natural philosophy and modern moral philosophies. And, there's a relationship. And yet the one in natural philosophy just kind of goes off untethered. The one outside the natural philosophy, just like moral relativism, it just goes off untethered. Whereas the one in natural philosophy has these requirements of matching up to nature, so it's a good place to refine these principles. Now add to that in our era, the scientists no longer make a lot of philosophical claims about the natural philosophy, and indeed don't call it natural philosophy, right? Now they used to back in the classical model and in Newton's era, and everything is in its place. They took all kinds of philosophical, belief in determinism. Okay, after that broke down, and they got the Standard Model 1, the new models of quantum mechanics and relativity are so weird they're hard to draw these conclusions from. And 2, they had been burnt drawing conclusions, and they realized, well, listen, we're making mathematical predictions, and as far as the interpretations, that's more difficult. Okay, so I had been deducing this philosophy and really happy with myself, as if nobody else had figured this out. But as when I went to school and I was studying physics and math and philosophy in college, I came to more and more of a realization that, there's this thing called skepticism, and this ancient skepticism. And what I had deduced from science, basically this idea that all knowledge is just theoretical. No matter how sure you are of it, it's still a theory. You can act on it, and it has all of the solidity of a strong, real thing, but it's also material, so put under enough pressure, it'll shatter or bend, So it's not absolute, all knowledge is theory. Well, this was taken from skepticism, and it's just a historical fact. And I started to learn this when I took the history of science, and they trace it back to philosophy. And what happened, this funny thing is, not all natural philosophers were skeptics, not at all. It's just that they were philosophers. And the epistemologies they had to choose from, they might choose any one for their own personal belief, but when talking to another scientist or natural philosopher, the highest, the most difficult, the most stringent epistemology is the skeptical one. And it says that instead of arguing because it's obvious that God wants it this way, or we can't apprehend the truth, or any of these things, you simply argue from the evidence, and it goes with empiricism. So you could be a Christian, but still use the skeptical epistemology is a part of this hobby of natural philosophy, investigating natural philosophy, because you're not going to make claims that are too exceptional, and you're always going to be able to be forced back if nature doesn't match up. Okay, well, it's funny that one of the books you showed, because the Outlines of Pyrrhonism by Benson Mates, that is a very, very formative book in my life, and the reason is that I was fortunate enough to know Benson Mates, in that I took a course from him when he was translating that book. He was a professor emeritus, and he had a seminar. There was about 8 students in it, and Benson Mates. And he had been translating the Outlines of Pyrrhonism, basically for fun, for a retirement thing. He's a famous logician, excellent, wonderful logician. He did not describe himself as a Pyrrhonist at all. He said he was an old logical positivist. But as a logician, which really was his primary thing as a career, he found Pyrrhonistic logic impeccable. And if there was a way beyond it, it wasn't a purely logical way. Um, so, so yeah, so he had translated this, and my copy of that book is a typewritten, not quite final draft. We'd come in and talk about the philosophy and the translation and the philosophy of translation and skepticism, and Benson Mates would tell us, his stories about his skeptical friends, and as I had said before, the best part of my education was talking with some of these professors that I really liked after class. And it's funny, some of them I did not learn their significance historically until later, like Paul Feyerabend. I would walk with him after my class with Paul Feyerabend. He was just a fascinating man. I didn't even know he was an anarchist, but I did get a hint of it because they wouldn't let him grade his class. That was chaos, that class. All the TAs did all the grading and testing and stuff because evidently he used to just give everybody A's. Being an anarchist. But yeah, well, really, I mean, it's him and this guy Fritz Stahl, and then Benson Mates were the three most, those were the main people I'm thinking of, and especially Benson Mates. Now, so what I know about Pyrrhonism goes back to that course, and having read that book, that translation of Benson's several times through with Benson there. And it was, I think it was my last year of college, and it was sort of, finally I had realized, and it was a huge thing for me personally, because I was like 13, loving philosophy of science, making up my own philosophy, and it's like 16, 17, 18, I'm going to school, it's like, I'd create my own philosophy, I've created something new, woohoo! And then senior year, it's kind of like, oh, actually, I just discovered what was put into science consciously, and there's this ancient skepticism. And so it was a weird thing, because whereas I had been bucking tradition, and you can't tell me I'm going to use science for my knowledge, forget religion and old dogmas, and then it turned out actually I was a strong believer in a tradition a few thousand years old that I had deduced from my culture. It's like this tradition had infused itself out into the culture through science and various means. I had rededuced it, but instead of, wow, I've invented something new and great, it was like, oh, I discovered something old and great. And it's a key point in my maturity of, loving the world and accepting that you need other minds and want other minds, and that there's good things out there. And sort of a view of the knowledge of history and how it seeps into language and culture, and then back into a mind, and it's sort of processed through this filter, and sometimes we feel cut off from its origins because we don't know them, but in reality you're never cut off from those origins, and they remain to be discovered. So there's a lot of people that like to think scientifically that haven't gotten far enough to realize that, oh yeah, there's this very clear philosophy, skepticism, Pyrrhonistic skepticism. So I usually don't like to quote particular philosophers or anything for certainly not to add weight to my arguments, and I wouldn't, except for, I would have to say I feel very lucky to have known Benson Mates and been there and benefited from him walking, just knowing him anyway. He was an awesome guy. I like logicians, and so I feel almost like I was lucky enough to be a part of a little bit of history or something, because that book is out there, and it's one of the main translations, and it shows up like this. So anyway, yeah, other than that, of course, I agree with you and your points, and it's good to see that somebody else sees how Gary, he's smart enough to really know what's going on, so he does qualify these things. He just doesn't realize that when you qualify something like that, that's making it relativistic. It's relative certainty is enough. To act on hate, Nazis and all this stuff, relative certainty is more than enough. Just like, a relatively strong material is good enough to build a skyscraper. You don't need infinitely strong. It might be nice if it was infinitely strong, but if somebody says it is, then they're just crazy. So you should worry, not be satisfied. And it's the same thing with knowledge. All right, cheers.